Now, I think a great place to work with the loops is at the bottom of the app.js file, our nice little print log handler. Right now here, I print the entire array like this, which means that we get output like this, which is not super readable. With the loops, we can actually improve that because now we can loop, for example, through all entries in the battle log and output something nicer there. But I'll actually start with another loop, and that's the normal for loop. I say normal because that is the oldest for loop, and that also is a syntax you find in pretty much any other programming language. Not necessarily the case for off and for in, but for like this and the while loop, you will find that in 99% of all programming languages you can learn. So a for loop is created with the for keyword, then with parentheses, and then you have these three parts in there. The first part is a part where you initialize things for the loop. You could run a lot of different code here, basically any expression, so anything but an if statement or another loop can be executed here. You could call a function in here, but typically what you do here is you initialize a variable. You could initialize multiple variables, but in most loops you only need one, and that's that helper variable which you change after every iteration to execute code. So here I'll go with the classic example of initializing I to be 0. By the way, that should be a variable created with let because it will change in every loop iteration, so therefore it's a variable, not a constant. Then you have your exit condition, which is evaluated before every loop iteration, and there we could use that example from the slide with I smaller than 3, which means the loop body will only run if I is smaller than 3, which of course is the case initially since I is 0. And then separated by another semicolon, you have the code which you want to execute after every code execution. There you can do whatever you want. You could also omit this by just having a semicolon and nothing thereafter. Side note, you can omit every statement here, then you would create an infinite loop. You need the two semicolons here though. Now you would have a loop that runs infinitely, which is something you should be careful about because it can crash your browser since it clutters up memory and takes away all resources. But you could do that. In some rare cases you might need that. Here I don't want it, so I will stick to the old syntax, and I will also provide a third part here, and that's my code that runs after every loop iteration, and there I will increment I by 1. Again, here you could do different things. You could also say I plus 2, or I minus 3, so you don't have to increment it, but that's the most common use case, that you have a counter which you increment by 1, and you have some exit condition. You can of course also use values here which are dynamic. For example, here we could use battlelog.length. The length property is available by default on arrays, and this gives you the amount of items in the array. And this is actually a quite common way of going through all items in the array if you don't want to use the for off loop, which is a bit shorter. But if you don't want to use it, because you have to support very old browsers, for example, but more on that in the browser support module later in the course. But then you could use this and dynamically derive the length here, and therefore go through all elements in the array by simply having a loop that runs as long as you have items in the array. So that's just a side note. Here I'll hard code 3, and then for now just console log, let's say a couple of dashes here, so that essentially we should print 3 lines of these dashes here when we run print log. So let's save that, go back to the browser and reload, maybe perform one action and then click show log, and indeed you see 3 lines. You don't really see 3 lines here because my browser, the browser developer tools, automatically combine similar outputs, but you see the 3 here, which means it would have printed that 3 times. It just did merge it together into one output to save some space here. But it printed that 3 times. Now you might wonder why 3 times when we only execute this code as long as I is smaller than 3. Well, keep in mind that we initialize it to be 0, then we check this, then this code runs, then we increment it to 1. So we printed this once thus far, now I is 1, still smaller than 3, so we print this again, we increment I to 2, so now we printed this 2 times. Now I is 2, still smaller than 3, so this condition gets checked and is true, so now we print this a 3rd time. Now thereafter we increment this to 3, Now for the next iteration, this gets checked at the beginning as always. I now is free, is no longer smaller than free, therefore we exit out of the loop, but until this point we printed this 3 times, which is why we see the free here. So that's the normal for loop. Now as I said, you can configure this in a broad variety of different ways. For example, you could also have a for loop where you start with I being equal to 10, and you want to go as long as I is greater than 0, and then you decrement I for every iteration. And then maybe here we console log I. You could do that too. You have a backward counting counter now. If you do that and you click show log, we see 10, 9, 8, and so on all the way up to 1. We don't see 0 here because our exit condition is that I should be greater than 0. So for I equal to 0, this will never run. But this is also something you can do. And it really depends on which app you're writing and which use case you're having, which kind of for loop you want. This by far is the most common scenario, that you start at 0, that you increment, and that you then have a hard-coded or dynamic exit condition here. So either hard-coded like this or dynamic with something like battlelog.length. So this is also quite common to have an array length here as an exit condition. But theoretically, you can initialize I to whatever you want, have whatever condition you want to have here. Of course, also combined conditions are possible. And you can also adjust I or whatever you want to do here in whichever way you want. You also don't have to adjust I here. You could leave this empty, as I mentioned, and instead adjust I in here. That would also be possible. You could do that, for example, if you want to adjust I before you do something with it. Because normally this part here after the last semicolon runs after your code here, so after your loop body. If you want to do the adjustment before that runs, you can omit that last part and manually adjust like this. And now you will see if I reload here and I cancel and click log, now we count down from 9 to 0 instead of 10 to 1, because now we increment I before we print that. So that's all possible. You have a lot of flexibility there, and I can only encourage you to play around with that. For now, I'll leave it at that because we could spend hours just trying out different combinations here. But that being said, this is the most common scenario. And instead, let's move on to the for of loop now.